Hey everybody, wonderful to be with you all here on this beautiful afternoon. Today I wanted to go over this document that I put together called The Best Careers for Your Personality Type. When I you know, was reaching out on Facebook to talk to people and be like, hey, is this the kind of document that might be useful? I got a lot of feedback that careers based on personality type would be really useful for people. So I put together this document. So let's dive in and let's see if we can help you get some better direction on where you want to go in your career. So the main reason that I made this guide is that most people, or at least very many people, go through life and they have no idea what their natural fundamental instincts and predispositions are. And so it's very easy if you're doing things that other people have told you would be a good idea, if you're just focused on money or for whatever reason, if you find yourself in a path where you are fighting these very, very deep, hardwired kinds of ways of going about the world, and you don't realize it, and you've been doing it for basically your whole career, it's really easy to just assume that that's just the way things are, that work just has to suck, because that's all you've ever known, right? And if you're not aware that that there are different modalities and ways of being, and there are different activities that interact differently with your neurochemistry and your the neural circuits that you've built up over the course of your life, and there's more than enough people out there who are like, yes, work just has to suck. And so you're just like, oh yeah, they're right, because my experience has been that it's always sucked, because you haven't aligned with your natural way of being. And so I see this all the time, and people, they don't even realize what the problem is. They don't even realize that they're fighting these fundamental instincts. And so the result of that is resistance, it's low energy, it's disconnection from the natural state of joy. And, because people don't understand what the actual problem is, they don't see the root cause, because it's not something we're taught in school. It's not something that most people talk about. So they look at these kind of like surface level irritants. So if somebody's in a state of resistance, then there will be other things that might not be great. And every time something happens, that gets magnified times 10, because they're already in a state of resistance, right? Like if you think about it, like if you're hungry, and then somebody says something, you're much more likely to react negatively, because you're already in a state that is sensitive. Most people don't realize they're going through their whole careers like this. So, they'll throw the blame on their boss or their company, or, entrepreneurs may blame the market, right? They may be like, oh, people, they don't understand, and they don't want to buy, and they don't want to do this, they don't want to do the other thing, right? Or the competition, or people are stealing my stuff, or whatever it is, right? Some people will turn inwards and blame themselves. Oh, I'm just not good enough. Oh, I'm just not ever meant to be happy, all that kind of stuff. People will find something to ascribe the pain to, but since they don't know what's going on, they're not ascribing the pain to the real source of the pain, right? Which is that they aren't aligned with themselves. And so once people come to understand themselves, once you know what your natural preferences are, you can structure careers in a way that flows with that aligns with that, and that works with that. Now instead of, like if you think about on the African savannah, instead of trying to get the rhino to run as fast as the cheetah, or instead of trying to get the cheetah to climb the tree and eat the leaves that the giraffe eats, everything's doing what it's supposed to do in its natural niche, and everything works a lot better. And so like, it's almost like if you weigh a lot, and speaking as somebody who, has lost a lot of weight at various points in my life, right, if you drop 50 pounds, it's a whole hell of a lot easier to go run a mile. It does not deplete you nearly as much. And this is similar. This is a similar kind of effect in terms of energy, because you're not fighting that neural resistance, right? Life becomes easier. There's more energy. You have better sleep, better relationships, and just overall a better experience of life. Now, when it comes to the self-awareness, I always talk, there's two main things. There's psychometrics and there's authentic values. And, we'll talk about authentic values probably in a future guide. But for now, let's really dive into psychometrics. So first off, what are psychometrics? So a psychometric is a psychological measurement, right? it's like metric system measurement, that is designed to be predictive of behavior or experience or some other, external or reported outcome over the medium to long term. Now, a lot of people, they think you are like a fixed psychometric and it's exactly the same thing your whole life. And depending on the psychometric, that may or may not be true, right? So, I don't want you to think of this like astrology. Oh, that person is a Capricorn because they were born on X day. It's not like that. It's not something where you can simplify it to one label that's going to apply to everyone over the course of their whole life and where there's no nuance. Like that's an oversimplification. So all psychometrics will vary over time, but some are a lot more consistent than others, right? So some will move a lot with relatively little change in experience, whereas others they're much more deeply hardwired and they require a lot more to shift. So obviously the more that psychometric stays constant over the course of someone's life, the more useful it is. So the most stable psychometrics tend to have what's called a heritability of around 50%. So heritability just means that if you take all the dispersion, all the variation in a population, what percent of that can you ascribe to genetics, right? And so something that's, 50% is very high for heritability for anything related to psychology or personality. Now, if you look at the remaining 50% of variability, a lot of it can be accounted for by life experience that doesn't change. So there are three big critical neuroplastic periods. So a neuroplastic period is when the brain is shifting and learning and changing a lot and it's cementing certain lessons. So birth to age 5 is a very big neuroplastic period. There's another one that happens in puberty, and then there's another one kind of in the ages 21 to 25. And the earlier ones are bigger. So that means that by age 25, you have the genetic component, which is 50%. You've got the three neuroplastic periods, which, I don't know exactly what percent it is, but it's very meaningful. And most people at that point have certain psychometrics that are pretty broadly solidified. You can change any psychometric, right? If you have emotional trauma, if you have major life changes, if you have some profound, psycho-spiritual or psycho-emotional growth or healing, if you intentionally change them, right? Like this can all be done. That's all the exception rather than the rule. So the way that I want you to think about it is that, most people have pretty certain psychometrics that are going to be pretty solid, and without an unusual series of events, you can expect that to be the case. However, if for some reason, you do want to change certain psychometrics, you are not bound 100%. You're not locked in. It is possible to recondition yourself, right? Anything that happens in the mind can ultimately be shifted. It's just going to require work and reformatting and some other things. But it's one of those things where it's easier to sail with the wind unless there's a very, very, very good reason not to. So generally, looking at your psychometrics and just flowing with what's there is going to be the easiest path. So what psychometrics are we going to use? There's literally like hundreds of different assessments, and there's PhDs in psychology who have, they prefer this test or that test or the other test. We want something that's stable. We want something that provides a lot of information. We want something that provides specific, useful information that gives us actionable outcomes. And so when it comes to career fit, the two that I find that best meet these criteria, the best one is DISC, and then the second best one is something called Motivators. And they're often packaged together, and you can go take them at my website. There's some computer printouts that come with that. I really wouldn't try to use those. They're not very helpful, but I will teach you how to interpret things right here. And also, just so you know, if you go and you do take these at my website, I don't actually make profit off of that. I provide that at cost just because I think that this information is just so useful. So with that said, let's dive in and let's talk about DISC. So DISC is a psychometric. It's got 4 different measures. You have D, I, S, and C. Right? So this is pretty easy to remember. And what each of those letters stand for will make sense when we dive into it. Each one of those 4 exists on a scale of 1 to 99. So anything above 50 is high, anything below 50 is low, but the numbers do matter. Somebody who's at 51 is basically right in the middle, and somebody who's at 95 is going to be a very, very extremely pronounced tendency. And on that note, it's important to distinguish that DISC represents tendencies. It does not represent ironclad predictions. So if I go through and I tell you this is the D cluster, and you say, wait a minute, but I don't do that thing. Okay, I got that. But if you do 80% of the things, that's it. The point is that it's more likely than not this is the case. It's not an ironclad thing. It's just like with the numbers, right? They're not like the Capricorn. You either are a Capricorn or you aren't a Capricorn. And this is why I said, when you get into psychometrics, that's not how it works at all. And so I don't want you thinking with that kind of, a horoscope astrology thing. What I want you thinking on is in terms of nuance, in terms of probabilities, in terms of numbers. And DISC is often misused that way as well. People will just slap the letters on without understanding, how much and, what are the interactions and how does it interact with motivators and these other things. So, in particular, there are people, they'll give you the thing with a circle, but like the circle can't capture a DS or an IC very well. And those people do exist. A proper DISC assessment will give you 2 scores. One is your natural and one is your adaptive. So natural is where you prefer to be when everything's good. Adaptive is where you go under stress. Natural is very stable. Adaptive will change based on your coping strategies in any given environment. Generally, the closer your natural and adaptive are, the more your way of handling things in the environment that you're in that works, the more your means of coping with that environment is aligned with your natural preferences, and the happier you're going to be. This is why if you're in a career situation where you have to cope and adapt to something that's very different than your natural preferences, that generates stress. If you're in a situation where you don't have to do that probably because you've intentionally done this work and aligned it, then everything's so much smoother. Okay, so I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with neurolinguistic programming, but DISC measures are basically just clusters of metaprograms. And a metaprogram is an unconscious filter for how we perceive and interact with the world. The thing is, there's dozens of different metaprograms, and trying to go into all of that would get, probably more complicated than is helpful. So it helps to kind of group them together with the ones that correlate with each other, and that's how we get to DISC. And so by bringing conscious awareness to these previously unconscious filters, now, we can have just a better, smoother experience. The analogy I like to use is like, imagine if you're on the phone with somebody and they've got you on speaker and there's a lot of background noise. It's very annoying. And it's annoying at some level, and even if you're not consciously aware of it, unconsciously, you're annoyed. Now imagine they take you off speaker and they're just talking directly to you and there's no background noise. Everything is so much smoother. And if you are out of alignment with your DISC, then getting in alignment is going to be like that for your entire experience of life. Now, I have personally mapped out that DISC has some roots in neurochemistry related to the levels and the sensitivity of various neurotransmitters or neuromodulators. And I've looked at scientific literature. I've tested this out. I've done some theorizing. But we'll dive into what that is and why it matters. One book I will recommend if you haven't read it is Habits of a Happy Brain or Habits of a Happy Mind. One second, let me look this up quickly. Habits of a Happy Brain by Dr. Loretta Brunning. Highly recommend. It's very accessible, look at neurochemistry and some of the specific neuromodulators we'll be talking about. And I believe that this neurochemical connection is one of the reasons why DISC has the stability that it has. Now, finally, before we dive into DISC, just be aware that this measures the how people go about things, what types of activities and what types of processes and what types of thinking pathways they're going to use. It's not the why of what they're actually seeking. It doesn't tell you what goal they're trying to achieve, just how they go about their goals and how they think about that. The why is captured in Motivators, which we'll discuss after diving into DISC. So now let's take a look at DISC. So one thing as I talk about this, there is one thing where I'm going to talk about specific career roles that match to each DISC type. I am not saying that every person who is that DISC type is going to align with that career role. I'm just saying that there are aspects of that DISC type that are encapsulated that align with that particular job. So you could have, many different career roles that would align with what it means to be a high D. That doesn't mean that everyone who's a high D is a fit for every one of those career roles, because there's a whole host of other factors. So just be aware that if you say, hey, listen, I'm X on the DISC, but that's not a fit for me. I never said it was. I just said that it aligns with that aspect. So there are multiple aspects that have to be considered, and you as a person have to take into account all of those aspects, not just one of them, which is, why I want you to be looking at this from nuance and not trying to oversimplify. Also note that the potential career roles that I list are by no means exhaustive. It's just a sample. So with that said, let's dive in. So D is for drive, dominance, decisiveness, and determination. The primary neuromodulators, which is just neurotransmitters, it's just a different word for them, is dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And epinephrine is also adrenaline. So that kind of gives you the sense of what high D is all about right off the bat. These are neuromodulators related to motivation, goal seeking, and energy. So think about somebody who's got high adrenaline, right? A high D is going to be laser focused on outcomes. They're going to be willing to do whatever it takes to achieve the goal. They're very conflict tolerant. They don't have a problem having some kind of disagreement or having a fight, and then very often not even caring afterwards. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But they don't have the conflict aversion that most people have. It is a high energy, task focused way of being. When it comes to change, high Ds, they need change. They need momentum. It's one reason why a lot of high Ds end up as entrepreneurs, because they've got to be moving stuff forward. They've got a lot of energy. They want to be putting into stuff, and they want to be seeing stuff grow. They want to be seeing, accomplishing things and hitting goals and hitting targets. They tend to make decisions pretty quickly and stick with them. So superpowers of a high D is they've got tremendous drive and tremendous grit to get things done. They will, they'll do whatever it takes. They've got that determination. They don't, sit around and hesitate about, well, maybe I should do this or whatever. They're all in. They're working. They're putting in the effort. Weaknesses is they often have a bit of a temper, and there's a risk that in the course of getting to the goal, they take shortcuts that end up creating problems down the line. So common questions a high D will ask are what, as in what's the goal, and when, as in when do we need to get it done by. If they have some kind of conflict or stress situation, their response is going to be to fight. Just note that whenever we're talking about like a conflict response or a stress response, you're always going to want to look at the adaptive disc for that. High D maps to the element of fire. Generally, they do well in high octane environments. They want performance-based compensation, and they're very tolerant of risks. So some roles that, have lots of high Ds are entrepreneurship, financial trading, business development, active duty military, which is different than garrison military. As if you follow Jocko Willink, he's a big thing. And there's a big difference between soldiers on the battlefield and soldiers in the barracks or in the garrison, because one's a lot more political and one's a lot more adrenaline based. Fitness training, people, because again, immediate results, you put in the effort, you get the reward. That's just the way that works. So fitness training and athletics also has a lot of high Ds. So now we'll move on to the second one. The second one is I. I is for influence, inspiration, intuition, and interconnection. So the primary neuromodulator here is serotonin, which is related to social pride and group engagement. So high Is are social butterflies. They can go to a party and talk to 100 people and be perfectly happy. They're really good at building rapport with people. They're the kinds of people who have lots of connections, and they're keenly aware of social status, gossip, group dynamics, office politics, all that kind of stuff. That's something that they keep themselves naturally very informed on. So I is a high energy people focused modality, whereas D was high energy task focused. I is high energy people focused. Their relationship to change is generally easygoing. They don't need it like a high D, but they're generally good to go along with it. So they're not necessarily going to be pushing for it, but they're not going to be resisting it either most of the time. I mean, there are always exceptions. There's always certain amounts of change that if something goes against somebody's values, obviously they're going to resist that no matter what their personality type. But this is more about change for change's sake. There's not an instinctive resistance to change. Their decision strategy is a little bit impulsive. So the result is that, sometimes they'll overpromise or they will back out of commitments. So superpowers of a high I, they're wonderful at building rapport. They're wonderful at connecting with people. They're wonderful at empathy. Weaknesses is because they're so tuned to all the social stuff going on is sometimes they start to care too much what other people think of them. And because they've got all of this optimism, which is, that's another thing, another superpower of the high I is that their optimism in a very contagious way. So contagiously optimistic, I'll add in here. There's a risk of that becoming delusional, which gets back to the overpromising and the impulsivity. So common questions for a high I are who, as in who are they connected to? And their conflict response is to fawn, aka to try to talk their way out of things, charm their way out of things, people please, just make sure everybody's okay. So this is kind of the people pleasing demeanor. High I maps to the element of air for those of you who are into that stuff. As far as good career environments for a high I, they're going to do well in social environments. They're going to want connection, and they're going to do well in environments where there's lots of talking with people. So some career roles that have a lot of high I's are going to be relationship sales, media, marketing, recruiting, human resources, and customer-facing roles. Now we move on to the third component of DISC, which is S. So S is for stability, steadiness, structure, sustainability, strategy, and systems. So the primary neuromodulators here are oxytocin and vasopressin, which are related to close bonding. So high S is going to be focused on a small group of close connections, whereas a high I is going to have, want to go talk to 100 people. High S is going to have a small group of maybe 5 to 10 people they're really close to, and those are the people that they want to spend time with. A mentor of mine once called S Closet D because they want the outcome, but they want to do it in the right way so that it lasts and it doesn't have collateral damage, especially to the people they care about. High S also, they tend to bottle up their emotions because, again, they don't want to disrupt the people around them. And bottling up your emotions inevitably leads to, meltdowns or breakdowns or, sometimes if it doesn't come out at any point, sometimes even health challenges. So that's a challenge that they can face. So S is a low energy, people focused modality. High I was high energy, people focused. S is low energy, people focused. And so their relationship to change is that they prefer it to be gradual. They're okay with some change, but they want it to be gradual, digestible. They don't like a lot of change in a short period of time. And so as a result, they make decisions slowly. And they'll generally have a process that they'll go through, and that's how they make decisions. Superpowers, they're great at planning. They're great at creating standard operating procedures because they're thinking through, okay, what's the best way to do this? How do we optimize this? Weaknesses is that sometimes they can remain loyal even if a situation is unhealthy. So I've seen this often with people where it's like, you definitely should have quit your job a while back. Like, this is not a good work environment. This isn't meeting your needs. Why are you still there? And they'll be like, I don't want to leave, my coworkers, and what will they do without me? And I don't know, change is a lot. And like, that's the kind of thing that might happen with a high S. Another thing is that they can be kind of rigid in their processes at times. So common questions a high S will ask is how, as in how do we do this properly? And their conflict response is flight, aka avoidance. They just avoid conflict. They will just try to not be present for it, not be around for it. Kind of, say something and move on. They're really not into it. So S maps to the element of water. And in terms of career environments, high S individuals do well in gradually evolving environments with structure and with a relatively constant set of colleagues or coworkers. If you're a high S, you don't want to be in a situation where, like say like a salesperson who's going out and meeting new potential clients all the time, and it's always somebody new. For an S, unless they also have a high I, that will wear on them. They'd rather have a constant set of people around them who they know. And I've been working with Bill for 7 years, and I know Bill, and I feel comfortable with Bill. That's the kind of environment that a high S will prefer. Some career roles that have a lot of high S's: project management, operations, design engineering, those kinds of roles. And then finally, we get to C. So C is for caution, compliance, and conscientiousness. Primary neuromodulators associated with high C is endorphins, which is related to numbing pain and stress. So C is very concerned about risk and safety and security. They want to know all the variables and they want to get as much certainty as possible. So they want to get all the data. They tend to be very, very data focused, right? They like numbers, they like graphs, they like quantitative stuff. C is a low energy task focused modality. So S was low energy people focused, C is low energy task focused. And their relationship to change is generally they're going to resist change. C's don't like things to change. They like things to stay the same. And as a result, they avoid making decisions when possible. Superpowers, attention to detail. So, if you have something that requires somebody to say, okay, what could go wrong, can make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed, a high C is your person. And they're definitely, we'll talk to the career roles in a second. They're definitely places where high C's are super valuable and absolutely needed for exactly that reason. The biggest weakness of high C is analysis paralysis, because they can't make a decision, and, the perfectionism and all that kind of stuff, because, what if this and what if that, and is this good enough? I'm not sure it's good enough. Like that's a challenge with the high C. So common questions a high C will ask are why, as in, why is this piece of data the way it is? Because they want to make sure they fully understand everything. And what if, so because they want to make sure that they're covering every possibility. Their conflict response is to freeze. They'll just shut down. C maps to the element of earth. And now we can talk about those career roles. So a high C will do well in slow-paced environments where they have the time and the space to make sure that all the boxes are checked and all the details are ironed out. So some roles that have a lot of high C's in them, so tax lawyers, right? You got to make sure that you got everything correct. Like if I'm doing my taxes, I don't want my tax lawyer to be like, oh man, I forgot about that thing. Oh, sorry, the IRS fined you. Like, no, I want a high C tax lawyer who makes sure that everything's covered. Make sure you didn't leave any money on the table. Accountants, right? The books have to balance at the end of the day. Retirement planning, you don't want to be in a situation where, your financial advisor didn't properly plan for your retirement and now you're 92 and you have to eat cat food, right? That's not a situation you want to be in. You want a high C who's paying attention to details and thinking through the risks. Test engineers, and then software engineers. For those of you who have ever done coding, going through the bugs in code, that's something that's very amenable to high C's, which is also the reason why many people, many coders are prone to, perfectionism, anxiety, even depression. That's kind of related to this high C tendency, along with some other factors. Okay, so with that said, we'll move on to the motivators, which will be shorter than DISC. Motivators is broken into 7 different measures. So we've got aesthetic, economic, individualistic, power, altruistic, regulatory, and theoretical. They also exist on a score of 1 to 99. However, when we speak of motivators, we're going to use terms high and low, but we're also going to use mid-range. And so what happens is when you get your report from the motivators, it's going to have a little box So that represents one standard deviation on either side, or I think it's one standard deviation. So anything above the box is high, anything below the box is low, anything in the box is mid-range. Again, like DISC, these are tendencies, they're not ironclad predictions. Again, like DISC, the further to the extremes, the more predictive it's going to be. You can also think of that as the further a given motivator is to the extremes, the more important it is for you to consider that motivator and the more weight you should give it when you're assessing career fit. I will say that motivators are more likely to change over time than DISC. For many people, they stay relatively constant, but going through certain life changes will reliably produce changes in motivators. So just be aware of that and be aware that it's possible for those to change and shift to some extent. Okay, so the first motivator we have is aesthetic. So a couple things about aesthetic. One is high aesthetics run the risk of burning out very easily. So, much more than 40 hours a week, unless they regard what they're doing as being play, which frankly I recommend for everybody, they can burn out much higher than that. Somebody who's a low aesthetic, has far more capacity to put in long hours. High aesthetics are also, they're very sensitive to sensory experiences. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, right? They will really enjoy a good massage or a quality blanket or a beautiful sunset. I had an ex-girlfriend who was a very high aesthetic, and we'd be walking down the road and she would see a flower and she would just be so joyful and she would just be engaged and enraptured by that flower for a good 3 minutes, right? Just the beauty of the flower. Low aesthetics, not so attuned to such things, right? So this is where I say, a low aesthetic might put in a lot of hours, but then they'll miss the beauty of the sunset. Whereas the high aesthetic, will kind of soak up the juice of that sensory experience. But, because of the way those sensory experiences affect them, if you put them in a cubicle with artificial light and, that they're also absorbing that. And so it's really important for high aesthetic to have an environment that works for them, which we'll talk about in a second. So the factor that really unites these two components of high aesthetic is time, or presence in time. So low aesthetics will easily go to past or future, whereas high aesthetics are very much now in the present. And so as a result, it's really important for high aesthetics to have a physical environment that works for them. Natural or outdoor environments are ideal. Typical office cubicle, that's almost never going to work for them. So finding an environment that is relaxing, that is stimulating, that feels clean, that's enjoyable, can have a massive effect on engagement and productivity for high aesthetics. Economic, this is exactly what it sounds like, right? Somebody who's high economic wants return on their time and money. They're looking for a strong ROI. Low economics, less concerned about finances, more likely to, just barely support themselves and not do too much more than is necessary as long as they can support their lifestyle. This psychometric can be a good tool to see how much your drive for money is intrinsic versus installed from others. There are times where, it can be so conditioned into you that it does show up in the psychometric. But if you are in a situation where, for example, you do get a low economic and you're pushing really hard to make a lot of money, then it's very obvious where there's a gap there, and where perhaps it makes sense to reconfigure and focus on other things that are more important to you. Likewise, most of the time, if you have somebody who's high economic and they are struggling to make money, normally they're very, very keenly aware of that. Normally that's very, very present for them. The third motivator is individualistic. So there are two components to individualistic. One is they want to stand out from the crowd. They want to be unique. They don't want to be part of the sheep, going through whatever. And so the result is that can kind of be a challenge in big companies, because big companies, normally they have like fixed roles and that's just how they operate. So high individualistics generally do best in smaller companies where they can have more freedom to define their own role and do their own thing. High individualistics also thrive on gratitude and recognition. They love the spotlight. They love being told what a good job they've done. most managers are not very good at this. So it's very common for high individualistics to feel underappreciated. So many individualistics get into coaching for this reason, because they love the feedback from clients, and they kind of make it about them. And I'll be honest, it's not the best reason to get into coaching. So if you go and you get your assessment and you're high individualistic and you're really thinking about coaching, I'd really just sit with that and just really sit, how much of that is about wanting validation and feedback from clients. And because I've seen a lot of people go into it for that reason and then get burned when they look at all the other stuff that you have to do, because there's a lot of work to get to that point. Let me just put it that way. That said, if you're willing to do all of those other things, and if it aligns with other components of your psychometric and other authentic values, and it all lines up, then great, right? It's just one of those things where it's kind of like, individualistics also very often they want to be movie stars or, TV show hosts or stuff like that. And it's just really important to recognize all sides of the trade-off of things, not just the glamour and the spotlight. Every job that has that kind of glamour spotlight component, right, has a lot of other stuff that isn't normally seen that has to be done to get there. And so it's just important to be aware of that. Low individualistics should avoid careers that put them in the spotlight or draw lots of attention to them. Low individualistics tend to prefer to be in the background. They don't necessarily want a lot of attention. Fourth, we have the power motivator. So there's two components here to power. There's control and there's responsibility. So high power wants to be in charge and make decisions, and they're willing to take responsibility for the effects of those decisions. Low power will avoid decisions because they don't want to make a decision and have it go wrong and affect people negatively. Now, if you have somebody who wants to be in charge and make decisions but doesn't want to take any responsibility for those decisions, that's something else that's not on these psychometrics. That's a different problem. But so a high power does well in managing teams of people, either as senior management in a company or as business owners. Mid-range power does best in autonomous roles. So they don't want to have people micromanaging them, but they also don't want to really be responsible for managing too many people. So they do best as freelancers, solopreneurs, or individual contributors with little to no micromanagement. If you're a mid-range power, and you've got like one BA or something, that's normally perfectly fine. That's normally going to align reasonably well. But a mid-range power isn't necessarily going to want to manage, a team of 10 employees, right? That would be too much and too much pressure, and that wouldn't really work well. And then finally, low power prefers structure provided by someone else. So that could be a manager who does put a lot of attention and a lot of structure into things, or it could be a partner in a collaboration of some sort. Fifth motivator here is altruistic. So high altruistic cares a lot about making the world a better place. So nonprofits and going to Africa and helping people get clean water and world peace and save the whales and help the poor and all this kind of stuff. Somebody who's a low altruistic isn't necessarily ungenerous, right? Some people kind of jump to that. They're like, oh, well, they must be Scrooge McDuck. No, that's not the case. They tend to be more focused on them and the people close to them. Sometimes, they may donate a lot to their church, or to, they might be there for a cousin who needs help or something like that. So they're not necessarily ungenerous, but they're less into the big save the world type causes. So high altruistics really need a sense of impact. So they do best in roles that have a strong narrative of making a difference. So this could be nonprofits, this could be their own companies with their own, strong reason why. This could be in local businesses. It can also be in organizations with a strong social mission. Most major listed corporations don't have that in a way that's congruent up and down the company. There are some that do, but there are others where like, for example, I think Patagonia is one that has like a very strong social mission and culture to it. I don't know if that one's publicly traded or not, but yeah, like a major corporation like Facebook or ExxonMobil or whatever would probably not be the right fit. Finally, not finally. Sixth, we move to regulatory. High regulatory like rules. So they like the structure of having a rule for everything and following those rules to the letter. That's something that's important to them. So some high regulatory careers would include, judges who are very textualist or very doctrinaire in how they approach things. Lawyers who are focused on procedure and detail. Not so much the trial lawyer who's like putting on a show for the jury. That's actually more, that's less about the rules and more about persuasion, right? But the ones who are like, wait a second, no, well, on page 353 of the contract, clause 632B says, that's a regulatory thing. Bureaucrats, fundamentalist religious leaders, high regulatory. Most of the people who come to me are low regulatory, probably just because of the nature of what I do. Helping people find their own thing, it kind of intrinsically is going to attract people who are low regulatory. If you are one of those people, then I would recommend avoiding jobs with rigid rules that either you have to follow or to apply or enforce in any way. And then finally, we have theoretical. So high theoretical is driven by curiosity and loves to learn for knowledge's sake, regardless of whether there is an application for practical use at any given point. I am a through-the-roof theoretical. I love to study. I love to learn. That's one of the reasons why I do what I do. Your stereotypical high theoreticals would be academics, like professors and researchers, but also anybody who really like dives into an area and becomes an expert and really just loves learning about that thing for its own sake, regardless of whether it's going to be useful or make them money. Just by developing that level of mastery, they develop this competitive edge as expert consultants, just because that area is fascinating to them. Low theoreticals prefer to learn what they need to learn and be done with it, or to learn by doing rather than to sit down and do book study. So anything that involves a large amount of continuing education is probably not ideal for them. Okay, and so with that said, you now have 11 potential indicators that can not just help you find careers that are a fit, but perhaps more importantly, steer you away from anything that's going to cause significant friction, because that's kind of the point of this, is to start removing friction from your life by understanding what works and what doesn't work for you. One story that I like to use here is I once had a client he tried 26 different things, and he hadn't found something he enjoyed. But all but one of those, when he gave me his list, all but one of them was a sales role, and he was a low I who didn't really like that much interaction with people. So like all it took was one DISC test to reveal something that had been haunting him his entire adult life. So hopefully this is all useful. I will say that when you have different combinations of DISC and motivators, there are emergent effects that can arise. So some combinations will work together to create more precise directions. Some of them will create challenges that require kind of unique or particular solutions. And I just unfortunately don't have time to cover every possible combination, right? We've got 11 different variables. You can do the math of how many different possible combinations that would be. But if you are interested in personalized reading of your results, feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss making that happen. And then, as I said, at the beginning, psychometrics are a big part of this. The other part is authentic values, and hopefully I'll be making a guide for that, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining me this wonderful afternoon, and I will see you on the other side.